Welcome to Shelter in Solidarity, a deep dive with artists and activists during this COVID pandemic. I am your co-host this evening, Joe Ramsey, Zoom casting and Facebook live streaming with you here from Dorchester, Massachusetts on the south side of Boston. We're welcoming you to our June show. We have moved to a once a month schedule here on Shelter in Solidarity as opposed to our twice a month schedule. We're really glad to have a very special June show for you, focused on adjunct life, literature, and struggle. And I am joined tonight with co-host Linda Liu. Linda, good to see you on the screen.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here, and I'm so excited that we have our guests today.
It's great. And we'll get right to them in a moment. So as I mentioned, tonight's theme is adjunct life, literature, and struggle. And we will be having a discussion with special guests, novelist Christine Smallwood, author of The Life of the Mind, and scholar and educator Maggie Doherty, who's the author of a terrific article in The Nation titled Adjunct Hell, as well as The Rise of Adjunct Literature, author also of The Equivalence, an acclaimed book in itself. We'll be exploring the relationship between art, experience, and activism in a contemporary higher education system increasingly characterized by contingency, inequality, and uncertainty. Christine Smallwood, first off, I just want to welcome our guests. Christine and Maggie, welcome to Shelter in Solidarity. We could hear you. Make sure your mics are working. Here on Zoom, you can only be seen when you are heard. So Christine, it's welcome to Shelter in Solidarity.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And Maggie, it is great to have you with us.
Great. Thank you so much for putting this together.
Great. Just a few more words about our guests as we get started. Christine Smallwood is a critic and journalist and the author of a novel, The Life of the Mind. Really a terrific novel I can't recommend highly enough, and that I'm sure we'll just be starting to do justice by the end of the hour. We have Christine with us tonight. Published in March 2021 by Hogarth Books. She is a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, contributing editor at Harper's Magazine. Her fiction has also been published in N+1, Vice, and the Paris Review. She is also co-founder of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and is a fellow with the New York Institute for the Humanities. I'm hoping we can talk a little more about that Brooklyn Institute before the day's done. Maggie Doherty is author of the recent article in The Nation on the rise of adjunct literature, as well as I mentioned the acclaimed book, The Equivalence, A Story of Art, Female Friendship, and Liberation in the 1960s. She teaches writing at Harvard, where she earned her PhD in English. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, and The Nation, among other publications, and she lives in Cambridge. I should note also that later in the show, we'll be bringing in and introducing two excellent respondents, West Coast folks, to join our East Coast discussion. Otherwise, as we seek to connect this discussion of literary representation and its institutional context to pressing questions of higher ed, injustice, and labor organizing. Those two respondents will be Nicola Walter and Joe Barry, and we'll introduce them formally in a little bit. But we're going to try to zoom in on the literary work first, and then bring the kind of political organizing into that context as we go. Back to Linda.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So just a little background about how Joe and I came to find Christine's book, The Life of the Mind. It was actually through us both first reading Maggie's recent review in The Nation on the rise of adjunct literature. And two novels in particular, Christine Smallwood's The Life of the Mind, of course, and Lynn Steger Strong's Want. They both feature female protagonists working as adjunct university faculty. And from Maggie's review, we found Christine's novel, The Life of the Mind, as well as Maggie's own book, The Equivalents, a story of art, female friendship, and liberation in the 1960s. So the Nation review itself is brilliant, and I related to it so much that I started getting a kind of visceral reaction. It dredged up painful memories of contingent faculty work for me, and also a fair amount of anger, um, as well at the current state of higher ed in the US. So there's so much I can say about what struck me about Maggie's review and Christine's novel. So I'm just going to highlight a few passages before we bring in our guests. Maggie, your review begins with the sentence, "Not so long ago, there seemed to be something radical in rejecting the future," and then goes on to discuss how such a position associated with works like Lee Edelman's 2005 book, No Future, may no longer be tenable under our contemporary circumstances, what with looming climate catastrophe, rising inequality, and a global pandemic that we're still in. A growing number of people cannot be assured of job or financial security, and much less can they expect their lives to follow conventional scripts of the good life. So it's hard for many people, I think it's fair to say, to even imagine a viable future at all for their children or even for themselves. So this question of relating to and imagining the future is a central theme in Christine's novel, which follows several weeks in the life of a woman named Dorothy, who's just had a miscarriage and bleeds continuously as she teaches and prepares for her university classes, visits doctors and therapists, and participates in an academic conference. So these are just some of the basic plot points in a story that's otherwise hard to summarize in conventional terms, and that arguably isn't much about plot itself, since so much of it is set in the mind and body of a character suspended in limbo with little sense of clear progression. As Maggie's review describes it, quote, "Processes that should be linear and finite, a course of study, a school term, a pregnancy, become unpredictable and unending. Plot, the literary structure that signals progress, gives way to an atmosphere of anxious uncertainty, one familiar to many of us who came of age during a moment of financial and ecological crisis." And just to quote one of the many passages I underlined and deeply sympathized with in The Life of the Mind, and to give those who haven't yet read the book a sense of Christine's forceful prose, quote, "Dorothy was an adjunct professor, a member of the part-time or contingent faculty who taught 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 courses a semester in the English department and first-year writing program of a private university whose list price tuition was twice her annual earnings. In addition to writing Apocalypse, this semester she was also teaching writing affect theory and 2 sections of Introduction to the Major. She had taught all the classes before and devoted to them the minimum effort required so she could write the sample chapter that would get her the job that didn't exist. It didn't matter how much time she cleared. She was not making progress. All her samples had to be thrown away. She hated producing so much waste. Her subject, female confinement and the Gothic novel, had become a source of nausea as her own career had come to resemble the situation of the characters she wrote about. She was like a poor relation who had tagged along for a weekend at a formerly grand estate and wound up marked for death by the invisible hands lurking in the wallpaper. Last fall, there had been 6 job openings in her field. This fall, there had been none. The hiring climate had dried into a dust bowl. She couldn't go on like this, she knew, but she also could not go on. She vaguely recalled a time when wanting to do the job she had trained for did not feel like too much to want. Now, want itself was a thing of the past. She lived in the epilogue of wants. So, among many things, I'm very interested in this state of limbo that is described throughout the book, and that comes from precarious employment and our current historical situation in general, and of course the affects that come along with it. for kind of adjunct literature that other contingent faculty and maybe growing numbers of Americans can relate to as well. All right, so on to Joe. Joe, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was looking at the document I was about to read. Thank you, Linda, for that. I think I'm so glad to hear some of the actual really strong prose from these writers before we start hearing their voices live. To add on to Linda's kind of fascination with this depiction of limbo, which I think is such a profound and pervasive kind of structure of feeling, you might say, among contingent faculty members, particularly those perhaps who have just come out of grad school or who have come from so-called elite institutions. At the same time, as a contingent faculty and higher ed union organizer and radical educator myself, I couldn't help but ask, in reading this novel and preparing for this discussion, what are the ways in which illuminating the impasses and the effective experiences of adjunct life be a step towards raising consciousness and creating new opportunities for frank discussion, and perhaps even for organizing around topics that are often seen as too shameful for public view. One of the things I was fascinated with in The Life of the Mind is the kind of continual kind of struggle, or I don't know if struggle is even the right word, but the continual kind of split in the protagonist, Dorothy, between what she's feeling kind of privately and what she expresses publicly, right? In that sense of not only that she feels like afraid or ashamed to say something public, but almost kind of a kind of attachment to keeping things private, to kind of keeping a fragmented world where one thing doesn't flow into the other, and yet there seems to be no way to keep one realm from flowing into the other, whether it's in the form of these, this waste, perpetual kind of metaphors of waste and overflowing of bodily functions that kind of erupt any kind of notion of like the autonomous, protected self. So I just think, one thing that struck me about The Life of the Mind, and I'll just, make one point and then kick a question to Christine and Maggie, is that it seemed this is a book not only about a kind of, that offers like a very, intensely realistic psychological depiction of an adjunct faculty member, a contingent faculty member, but it's also a deep probing reflection on kind of the contingency of modern or contemporary life itself, the contingency of our environment on Earth, and the way that environmental crisis is kind of shaping the consciousness of intellectuals, of students, of teachers, the contingency of the very idea of a kind of American middle class, the very idea of a stable future that could sustain, quote unquote, middle class families, right? So one thing that struck me about this book, it's not just an account of contingent academic workforce, but like contemporary contingency in general, kind of uses the particular vantage point of a contingent faculty member, a female contingent faculty member, to offer some quite, profound kind of reflections on just kind of the contingency of the very idea of thinking the future, of planning a life in this contemporary moment. And I just think it's profound on many levels. You don't have to be an academic or an adjunct or a former adjunct to appreciate this novel. For those who are sitting in who may not be as inside this discussion as some of us certainly are. But that's just a few words of praise. So thank you, Christine and Maggie, for your work in helping make this discussion possible today.
Well, it's sort of overwhelming that is so what I had hoped people would take from the book. And so I'm just really grateful that you read it that way, and really grateful to Maggie too, who situated it in the way that she did. And I just, I felt very seen, and I felt like the book was being very seen. And yeah, it was just like such a strange feeling to read a review and be like, this is everything I could have hoped. And then to put it in the context that she did with No Future, Maggie, it was just, thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you for writing. My goodness. I think one thing that we should also note is like this book is so, intense, and, there are moments where it's really grappling with these incredibly challenging questions. It's also very funny. I laughed out loud at so much of it. And I think, Joe, you were talking earlier about ways that talking about this can be sort of hopeful. And I think I'm always predisposed to see humor as a way of finding hope, or finding something to kind of get out of a messy, hard situation. So, the book is really kind of a serious intervention, but it's also just like a joy and a pleasure and so fun to read.
Right. I mean, Linda read the first sentence of Maggie's review, but I think the first sentence of Christine's novel deserves to be read aloud as well to capture a little bit of the kind of dark humor, right, that characterizes this text. I mean, Dorothy was taking a shit at the library when her therapist called, and she let it go to voicemail. Okay, right. This is, I mean, so this idea. I mean, and again, it's this. I almost feel like if you could. This is a book that's very committed to kind of making shit public, right? In some ways, share your shit, might be, or you can't help but share your shit, whether you want to or not, I feel like. And I can't help to wonder, I mean, you mentioned Lee Edelman's book. I wonder about Mark Bousquet's work on the waste product of graduate education. I don't know if you are familiar with that work as well. Oh, okay. Christine, I think you're in for a treat. It's in Mark Bousquet's excellent book, How the University Works, but it was a breakthrough essay. I heard at Marxist Literary Group years ago. Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling and just ask you both a question, but maybe Christine first, and then to Maggie. And that is, Christine, basically, how did you come to write this book? And I mean, and you can take that question any way you like, but I do hope that you will take it also in terms of like, how would you describe your arc and your arcs or whatever, your path in terms of your relationship to higher education? Your kind of inside-outside relationship, past and present, to the university or to, the idea of the university. And if you could give us a little sense of, kind of the process, the kind of individual social kind of thinking process that this book came out of. And then also maybe say a little more about, what you hope this book will communicate. It sounds like you're feeling like some of it is being communicated, which is great. But if you could elaborate a little more about what your hopes were, or the hopes that you dare not speak aloud, but the what you dared to hope as to what difference this book might make in terms of some of the ways that these discussions about higher ed occur or don't occur.
Well, I mean, I guess I should start by saying that I didn't really dare to hope anything. I have been a little bit surprised by the fact that the book has been positively reviewed in a number of publications. Like I definitely, in my mind, I'm a book critic, so I was like, probably will be reviewed in like maybe this one place that I write for a lot, and that would kind of be it. So when I think about like it making an intervention, like it's really exciting. But I definitely didn't like think when I was writing like, oh, this will be like my statement on the way things are and people will care. I definitely didn't think people would care. But I can say like when I started writing it, I started writing the book after I was done with grad school. So I finished grad school in 2014. And I before grad school, I had worked as an editor at The Nation magazine. I worked as the assistant literary editor and then the associate literary editor. And so I was like writing for publications as a grad student. Maggie, did you start writing for publications as a grad student also? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I had been writing for publications kind of at the same time. So it wasn't like I left grad school and then became a magazine writer. I was kind of like doing both tracks at once, which Maggie, as you know, is kind of hard to do and makes you feel like a little bit crazy all the time. Was that your experience?
Yeah, I mean, these worlds actually don't overlap at all. I think people often think that, the life of the mind, right? Well, it's happening in the New Yorker and the Nation, and it's also happening in universities. It's actually, my experience is that these are completely kind of parallel universes and they don't really communicate that much.
Yeah, and you're stealing time from your dissertation or your grad work to write a book review here or an essay there or whatever. That was true for you?
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
Yeah, and so, but then, and I started writing fiction as a grad student. I actually hadn't really, I had written fiction as like a child, but it wasn't like an aspiration of mine to be a fiction writer. But in the middle of grad school, I started to write some fiction. And then I wrote like the first like 10 or 12 pages of the book when I was pregnant with my first son. And I just had like a kind of burst of creativity that like you hear about this thing that happens, and like it was cool. It happened to me. I like sat down, I wrote 12 pages, and then I thought that I was done and that was just going to be like this sort of fragmentary short story. And I published it in N+1, and then I was trying to write a collection of short stories that just was going very badly, and the stories were not very good. And then everybody had told me that they thought that story from N+1 like felt like part of a novel. And so I finally decided I would go back and like sort of just extend Dorothy's story. And so I think that, like everything kind of came out at once in the story, like Dorothy, the therapist, the miscarriage. And I think I made her an adjunct in part just because it was the only world I kind of knew, was the world of the academy and the university and higher education. And I think that affectively, the situation of an adjunct is not dissimilar to that of a freelance writer, which is what I was. Like, both are kind of situations of uncertainty and precarity. And so I felt like I could maybe like bring that to life. And I do think some of the affective landscape of the graduate student is similar to that of the adjunct, you know, like they're not totally the same, but there was some stuff I could draw on. And then obviously I knew people who were really truly laboring in adjunct hell. But I didn't make her, you know, we know stories about adjuncts who are like on food stamps or who are like living in their cars. I mean, there's some like really extreme deprivation. And that's definitely not the novel I wrote. You know, I did not write like the worst of the worst. I kind of wanted her to have a more almost like garden variety precarity. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think makes it really interesting because of the limbo that we were talking about earlier, because it's not so bad that she doesn't have time to reflect on what she's doing. She's reflecting all the time. She's sort of saying, you know, I'm not writing, does that matter? Maybe not. Well, like the apocalypse is coming anyway. But she also doesn't really, the situation's kind of good enough for her to stay in it and bad enough for her to be unhappy. And so there's this real kind of stasis to it. That I think works really well.
And she has like security in the form of her boyfriend with whom she lives. But, you know, as whenever one has security from a partner, then there's like a kind of question of like, what is the relationship, right? Like, is this a good relationship? Like, we don't really know. You know, it's certainly like a necessary relationship because like definitely Dorothy could not pay her rent on her own.
Which is also not dissimilar from the freelance writer situation,
right?
As I am often sort of gossiping about or nosely trying to figure out, well, how does that person make it work?
Right.
You know?
Right.
Oh,
And you know, honestly,
that's like a corporate lawyer. Okay, this is
totally. And honestly, that's like the first thing whenever the younger writers come to me and ask me, like, how did you do it? I'm always like, I am married and on my husband's health insurance. You know, it's like always like the first thing I say, because to say anything else is a lie. You know, like I don't pay for my own health insurance.
Christine, I'm glad to hear you say that. I mean, it was funny. I shared Maggie's review of your book before I'd even read the book. I shared it on like 7 or 8, you know, Facebook pages for, you know, remaking the university and these various kind of blogs and Facebook pages and adjunct advocacy pages. And a couple of people wrote after just reading a few of the passages that Maggie quotes from the book and saying, oh, this character only teaches 2, 3, or sometimes 4 courses. Yeah. Like, you know, I teach 5, sometimes 6 or 7. So there was, I mean, obviously that's the kind of initial response, but I think it's important that you are situating, right, you're just, you know, the novel in the way that you have, right? It's not the person who's, you know, on food stamps living out of their car, right? It's a particular sector of this kind of, you know, adjunct contingent faculty world, which is a significant one, I think, and an important one, but certainly not the only one. And I think
it's certainly not the only one. And I mean, the classes that Dorothy teaches, I gave the book in draft to read. I gave a friend who's a professor, who's like a long time, like on contract professor, to read the book in draft. And, you know, she was like, these classes are really cool that Dorothy teaches, you know? And I was like, that's true, because I really want to have a scene with Sylvan Tompkins. And so like Dorothy like has to teach these kind of, I mean, I did, you know, I adjuncted like I adjuncted like 2 classes at NYU when I was still in grad school. And I taught these sort of like comp classes where you get to design your own syllabus. And so I gave Dorothy those classes because I wanted her to be able to have certain thoughts about the world. So she needed to be teaching these kinds of classes. And yeah, I mean, she teaches like sexier classes than most adjuncts get to teach, but I was like, well, it's a novel, so that's what it is.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's great to hear this awareness of what you're doing, you know, in your work. I think Linda was going to ask Maggie something here. Draw Maggie's own position in a little more here.
Yeah, so Maggie, I'm wondering how you would locate yourself with respect to the university or academia today, and how did you come to write that Powerful Nation review, one title of which was Adjunct Hell? And how do you see this work on adjunct lit related to your own experiences and your own writing and research?
Yeah, thank you. These are, it's really great for all of us to sort of share where we're coming from. So I'm a full-time, well, not anymore. I have been a full-time contingent faculty member at Harvard, which is where I did my grad education for the last 7 years. And what that has meant has been sometimes having 2 classes in one department and 2 classes in another, or 4 classes in one department. Or more recently, what I've done is I've taken 2 classes in one department and I've started teaching continuing education, because that ended up sort of making more sense for my life and my family's life and all of that. And it was the kind of thing that when I first got a job offer, I felt just incredibly lucky, because I think, Christine's novel just reminds us just how terrifying it is to graduate a PhD program and have just nothing like waiting for you, and having spent all this time training for a job. And one thing I always tell younger people who say, should I go to grad school? Should I get a PhD? What kind of grad school should I go to? I always say that in my experience, it is a form of job training. There's often, this is why I love the title of Christine's novel, there's often this kind of gloss over it, which is, it's just people getting together to talk about ideas and things they're passionate about. But then in my experience, it is really pretty oriented to this idea that you are going to be professing the subject of your study. You have to learn how to write a conference paper, and you have to learn, how to write a peer-reviewed article, and you're really training to do this really, really specific thing. One thing that's interesting is I did not get a ton of training on how to teach, even though for most people who go to grad school, what they will end up doing, kind of no matter where they fit in the academic hierarchy or whatever, is teaching. That's going to be a huge part of their life. And that in my experience was I did not get as much instruction on that as I would have liked. So when I got these jobs, I was so grateful. I really love teaching. I've always loved teaching. I went to grad school because I wanted to be a teacher, which is kind of hilarious looking back at that decision. And it was really overwhelming. But what was also kind of strange about it, which I think Christine's novel gets at, is this limbo, because it's at Harvard, all non-tenure track faculty are time capped. So whatever the position is, if you're not on the tenure track, after 3 years, 5 years, or 8 years, you have to go. It doesn't matter what your, results have been in the classroom. It doesn't matter if you have anything to go to. It's just you have to go. They actually, in a recent memo, called this regenerating the teaching core of the university. It's a form of regeneration. As if, it's very, Ishiguro kind of, they're harvesting the sort of, I don't know, it's pretty creepy. But anyway, so it does create this kind of limbo feeling where the job is a full-time, immersive, intense job. And the idea is that they want you to care about it. Like, you're not supposed to be doing this kind of as a day job, or not something you take seriously, because part of the billing at one of these institutions, like the kind that Christine's writing about in her novel, is that these are expensive schools that people are supposed to, be getting the best education at. And so there's this weird kind of double speak around faculty like me who are contingent, where the administration at once, in one voice wants to say, these are amazing faculty. You are studying with amazing faculty. And then in the next breath has to say, but of course they're actually, not very good. And that's why we have to let go of them after a period of time. So it meant that I was doing work that I felt really engaged by and took really seriously and really liked, but then very, very conscious of the clock running out and having to do something else. And I guess the 2 things that kind of made that viable for me were, one, writing, as Christine was saying, the fact that I had started freelance reviewing and criticism late in grad school and was continuing to do that while I had this job, which eventually led to a book and led to sort of a more viable career in that space. And I have been organizing in higher ed since 2013, and that has, given me the ability to be in this kind of work and feel all the things one feels doing it, and feel also that I have, a purpose in continuing to be here, and that there might be a way that I could be making it better while being here. So I am timing out, so I will no longer be teaching in the way that I have been, but I will continue to be sort of in and around the university, I think. I'll definitely still be continuing to teach continuing education.
We're getting a little bit of back reverb from somebody. Just make sure, folks, if you're not speaking, do please keep yourself muted. Otherwise, you may appear in any compromised state. We don't know. We'll see here on Zoom. Very interesting stuff, Maggie. I mean, actually, it does remind me of that Mark Bousquet article on the waste product of graduate education. One of his arguments, which, I mean, he focuses on the graduate student lecturer kind of more than the adjunct per se. But one of his arguments is that, you know, he uses the analogy of shit all over the place. You know, ultimately, like, institutions need to flush these people away, right? Because, you know, it's one thing to have a graduate student around for a while, even if they're kind of a militant union or something, because those folks, at least the structure of the profession is to have them go elsewhere ultimately, right? You know, very few institutions hire their own and so forth. But, you know, to have contingent faculty who have that kind of radicalized perspective, that inside-outside perspective, and then start to acquire and develop institutional memory and a sense of collectivity over time, you can see how that can be a very potentially in the best sense, from my perspective, destabilizing, right, of some of the kind of the power relations, or at least the hegemony on campus. So I'm sorry to hear that's happening to you. Although it sounds like at least it's good that you did have some parallel tracks working at the same time, so you're not being just thrown to the wolves or to the wind here. Although I guess in Boston you could probably find another adjunct gig, right around the corner.
Maybe, yeah, but I mean, I do think, you know, the way that, you know, what you're saying about, you know, the idea is that, oh, these grad students are supposed to go elsewhere, they're supposed to go away. And often, you know, they can't. And so they stay at the institution. So then the idea is that you have these, I mean, I think Dorothy and Christine's novel is a good example of this, these people who sort of, you know, are stuck in one place, and the idea of sort of moving or mobility or anything new happening just doesn't really feel possible.
Yeah, and I wanted to pick up on that. You know, a couple times you used this term kind of like, what is one's real work, right? The idea that, you know, that ultimately what most graduate students, or if they're going to get jobs in academia, will be teaching, and yet the process, the interpolation, the kind of ideological education you get in grad school oftentimes make you think the real work is the research and the scholarship and not the teaching. And I wanted to use that as a way to bring us back to Christine's novel, because that's, and actually in the passage that Linda read aloud a few moments ago, that's clearly kind of characterizes Dorothy's consciousness, right? That she's putting the minimum amount of work as she can into these classes, even though she has the slightly sexier classes, right? Because she's going to write that book for the job that doesn't exist. So, I mean, Christine, I wanted to give you a chance, and maybe Maggie and Linda, or anyone else who's read the novel, a chance too, to kind of step into that and think, you know, what is your relationship to kind of Dorothy as a character? Or what do you see in your narrative's relationship to Dorothy? It particularly as it comes to kind of her relationship between what she sees as her real work versus kind of the work she's actually doing. And I was just struck in the novel at the ways in which her relationships to students are kind of complex and kind of at a distance, moments of kind of contact and maybe potential, you know, a student who's going to who has to miss class to go to an environmental justice protest, students at the end of the novel. I don't think this is spoiling anything somehow, because it's not really plot, you know, but like she's having another kind of another instance of menstrual bleeding, right? Weeks and weeks and months after she thought it would end. And she's in the bathroom and she's overhearing these kind of two like shaven head women kind of talking about socialism and communism, right? At the same time, she doesn't like think she can ask them for like a pad. You know what I mean? Like there's a sense like she's like, I hope the younger generation will do the radical job, but I can't really talk to them. And I don't really want to get too close to them either. Right. And so I don't know, I just wanted to hear you and I don't know, Maggie's take as well. And maybe Linda's view on this too, of like, what do you see is what is your kind of view or what do you think is like the status of Dorothy in terms of these, what counts as real work, and what are the limits of her subjectivity? You think that maybe aren't your limits, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that like the miscarriage for me, and maybe this is like very corny, but it is a kind of like symbol for writing, you know? And so I think that like in my mind, like the book is really, like about the sort of shame of writing, right? And so I think that is why Dorothy thinks of like the writing as what's supposed to be her real work. Now we could like talk about like why that isn't really her real work, and like, or like maybe it shouldn't be her real work, or like, is she a good writer, or like, is she not a good writer? Like, I don't know, we don't really like get to see what her writing is like. But I think that's what is driving a lot of her angst, is this like, I mean, is she seems to be like blocked as a writer in one sense, and yet is like emitting this other kind of like writing that she would like to keep secret, but is like becoming public. So that's kind of how I was thinking about the stuff about her work. In terms of like the students and her interactions with them, I mean, she's a very alienated character, right? And she's very depressed. And so I think that those things make it very hard for her to have any kinds of social relationships. And so like throughout the book, we see her kind of like seeking care and seeking connection, and then also like withholding and making care and connection impossible. And she kind of, I mean, she has this sort of like ghostly quality. There was one scene that I cut really late where she goes into one of those like Casper stores to like buy a mattress, because I had this idea of her kind of like as like a ghost figure, but then I thought the book was getting kind of bogged down, so I cut that.
Intrigued. I'd like to read the scene.
Yeah, it's enough.
Yeah, no, very interesting.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say that one of my favorite scenes in the novel that I think also gets at sort of this generation thing that you were talking about, Joe, is the scene where she's imagining the raft children. She's imagining interacting with this younger generation who's been through, climate apocalypse, and they're, hungry, they have matted hair, they're living on a raft, and she's trying to explain herself to them, and they're just completely uncomprehending. And I think that's something I really struggle with now as a teacher in a way that I didn't. I used to feel like I could relate to my students really well. I felt very close to them. I didn't feel awkward around them. And part of that's just, I have gotten older. But I think part of that is trying to figure out what are we doing in a classroom together when we're looking at texts and looking at, talking about ideas, even ideas that we might find politically important at a moment like this. When the student is reciting the Tompkins and that voice, that's just sort of, yep, this is a theory, and the student missing class for a protest. On the one hand, Dorothy is thinking, well, I don't want you to miss class for a protest. But on the other hand, she's imagining these raft children and thinking, yeah, I guess that's fair enough. You should go to a protest. And I find this to be really hard. And I'd love to hear from other people teaching in universities right now. How do we justify reading books and reading novels and talking about novels and talking about psychoanalytic theory, and even talking about radical theory when there's work to be done and when the students kind of want to be out in the world doing that work?
Yeah, I think that's a great problem, right? I mean, how can you justify reading a whole novel, right? And there's a whole culture that says a tweet is good enough, right? And sometimes maybe a tweet is, I don't know, right? Some points can be made quite sharply, in this meme universe we're in. Although I don't think that the novel is superseded completely here by any stretch. Those raft children are horrifying and fascinating and funny too, right? It's another kind of child. It's not the child as the figure, the Lee Edelman child that is the figure that is kind of dominates the present in the name of reproducing future, kind of heteronormativity and futurity, right? The kind of repressive child that doesn't let anything change. It's the judging children of the future looking back on the present and being like, why didn't you shut down the power plants?
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And I think that like Dorothy, she's not a mother, right? And she's not very sexual. Like in the book, I purposefully did not give her like a sex life, and like we have two sort of flashbacks to sexual encounters, like neither of which are satisfying or good. And so like there's this question of like, how do we see someone like that? How do we see a woman like that? So there's like the scene where she gets into this ride share, and then a frat boy gets into the front, and he like literally doesn't see her until he's left the car, and it's because she like can't show up for him, because she's like, what do we do with a woman in her 30s who is neither like sexy nor a mom? Like we kind of like don't have a category for her.
But I feel like that also is exactly like her position in the university too, right? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So she's just kind of this like, she's just kind of like dealing with all of those feelings and that position. I mean, I think what you're saying, Maggie, is really right, that it's like, how do we justify anything we do at this historical moment? I think everybody, or not everybody, I think a lot of people are kind of feeling that no matter what their job is. Like, how do I get through the day?
Yeah. I think that's actually a great transition to Linda's next question. Linda?
Yeah, so this question is actually for, I think, both Maggie and Christine. So Maggie, in the introduction to your book, the equivalents, you talk about Virginia Woolf's famous essay, A Room of One's Own, which explains the importance of material resources for writers and intellectuals and creative types. So early in this essay, Woolf declares that a woman must have money and a room of one's own if she is to write fiction, and refers to the, quote, urbanity, the geniality, the dignity, which are the offspring of luxury and privacy and space. So the Radcliffe Institute for Independent Study, which your book focuses on, made good on Woolf's suppositions, giving institutional support, physical workspace and the time to do it in, and most of all, an all-female community to creative women in the arts and humanities. It seems that these kinds of material supports and sustaining communities are conspicuously lacking in the life of the mind, where Dorothy doesn't even have a campus office or a printer, much less institutional support or a supportive community. So in one scene, Dorothy is printing in the university library, and so I'd like to read the passage on page 211. So, so everyone just please bear with me for a moment.
Or
okay.
follow along if you have the book, which I do, so we just read along.
All right, so there were reams of paper stacked up by the printer. Dorothy messily tore one open and began loading the paper in the tray. Her therapist had directed her to think about all the things in her life that did work. She paused, loading the paper to check her email on her phone, which had the effect of summoning a gray-haired librarian. Just looking at her green sweater made Dorothy itch. Students aren't supposed to do that, she said. I'm a professor, said Dorothy. The claim or having to make it felt ridiculous. Of course the librarian didn't believe her. She didn't believe herself. She looked down at her clothes. They were shabby and studentish. Her hair was unwashed. She was probably shiny. Why are you printing here? Asked the librarian. You should print in your department office. Are professors not allowed in the library? Asked Dorothy. Her voice came out more sarcastic than she intended, and the librarian glared at her with actual contempt. The university really did despise her. Just look at this librarian, a keeper of knowledge, and her ruthless face. That's a real question, Dorothy said. I'd love to follow the rules if only someone would tell me what they are. The librarian took a step back as if Dorothy were some subway lunatic. Her shrug said, it's your life. She removed a handful of paper, Dorothy had typically overdone it, and shut the printer tray door. She pushed a button to test. There, she said, like she had just wiped up milk spilt from Dorothy's bottle. Dorothy looked into the future and saw herself, 40, 45 years old, a contingent member of the faculty, waiting on the printers, absorbing the admonishment of the crony librarian, and thought how naive she had once been to believe there was anything glamorous about the life of the mind. So I've been there in that scene in so many ways, and the lack of access to just simple material resources like a functional printer with enough paper in a department office are just a few of the ways in which adjuncts don't have close to enough institutional community support for their own teaching, never mind research. So I'm wondering if either of you, Christine and or Maggie, have any thoughts on what kinds of things have to change in academia so that all faculty can get the resources they need for both their teaching and their research.
Maggie, I'm going to let you do that because I feel like you're closer to the facts on the ground.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I kind of say this at the end of the piece, but I think the thing that's going to make anything change is, you know, grad students, adjuncts, contingent faculty, staff, you know, coming together to advocate for themselves and building power together. You know, I think the reason we don't have resources for teaching we don't have resources for research, is because that is a pretty efficient way to run a university. I mean, it's working. There's a reason that a lot of universities have adjunctified. It's a really great way to, divert money. And, this is the question that I always say when I'm organizing is not a question of, are there resources for this? It's a question of who controls the resources and where are they directing those resources? Their universities have resources. And right now they are deciding to use those resources in a way that I would say doesn't benefit students, doesn't benefit faculty, contingent faculty, adjunct faculty. I'm not really sure who it benefits sometimes. I mean, I think it benefits administrators to some degree, and sort of benefits sometimes the image of a given university if it is able to have, better facilities than it would have otherwise. But yeah, I mean, so I think this has to be power that's built by the people who are working in these positions and sort of in alliance, ideally, with undergraduates, graduate students, all of that. Because I think that it is, so many of us know, it's just so hard to do the work we want to do and that we might feel ourselves capable of doing, either for our students or for ourselves, if we don't have printers, offices to meet students in, if we don't have a break on occasion. That's what I've been. I went right into summer school from the spring semester, and I was just thinking, wow, I imagine having like a research term off, as I know some unionized contingent faculty in the area do. They've actually negotiated in their contracts a term off after a period of years as a research leave. And just thinking that, I would be such a better teacher, I think, if I could come back after that kind of time. So yeah, I mean, I don't think these are new ideas or new. I mean, I think people are saying this, and if organizers, faculty are saying this. It's just a question of how to actually kind of get that power together in order to get to make the changes that I think a lot of us think need to happen.
Yeah, and it sounds like this might be actually a great moment to bring Jo Berry and Nicola Walters into the conversation. As the question of power, the question of demands, the question of the power and strategy to actualize those demands, I think, has been raised quite sharply. Christine, would that be okay with you if we brought them in a little bit? I know you were wanting to listen more on this one, it sounds like, than speak. Yeah, I know, Christine. I'm afraid we will leave. We'll lose Christine around 8 o'clock. For important reasons, but hopefully maybe we can hear at least one more comment from you, Christine, before you have to take off. But Nicola and Jo, we'll give you a couple chances to kind of dig into some of the work you're doing. But I wondered if you might like to speak to essentially the question that Linda asked about, what are the kinds of changes that we need to see, what are the kind of demands, and maybe we could tack on to that. What are some of the strategies that you're familiar with, or that you're trying to employ as organizers, as well as kind of scholars of organizing? I should mention again, Jo Berry is a co-author with Helena Worthen of a forthcoming book, Power Despite Precarity, which is, I think, in some ways, maybe the book that Dorothy needs to read, or that, that the Dorothys of the world that we all need to read in order to kind of actualize some of this change here. And Nicola is very active on the fighting for the College for All Act and building an educational labor summit, aspiring to a national forum for that organizing. Nicola, let's go first to you and then to Jo. I mean, how would you feel that question about, kind of what is to be done and what is being done right now on this front?
Thank you, Jo. Well, I just want to start by first, little bit of self-care moment. I actually have to take a deep breath in after kind of talking about some of the adjunct experiences, because this is so close to home. And I think a lot of times we don't really give space for the fact that we're kind of many of us living and struggling through this at the present. So I'm just going to take a deep breath, and you can join me in a collective breath, a little grounding. I mean, so much of what you're talking about in your book, from the excerpts that have been shared and from reading Maggie's review, it just strikes so close to home. I mean, I lived in some sort of level of adjunct hell as a fresh graduate in 2017. I worked on 3 different campuses. I was on food stamps. I made this, 0.07% of our president's salary at the university. I worked on a community college on a reservation. I worked on a community college in my community, and I also worked as part of the CSU system. I was brought in as a faculty member to do adjunct lecture, faculty organizing through the California Faculty Association, and now the membership and organizing chair on our executive board for the state. So the way that I see power building and the needs of Joe, and Joe and I have some friends in common, you know, and have been involved with many folks over the years, but you know, the way that I see the needs of, like, I just feel so physically the powerlessness, the struggle, the shame, the silence that comes in from being a woman, a young woman in academia and doing the hustle. And so when we're talking about that sense of powerlessness, the only way that I've been able to find power in academia has been through unionized labor and through what the California Faculty Association has been working on, which I think touches on the needs to make visible so much that has been unseen in higher education in regard to gender, in regard to race, in regard to sexual orientation, in regard to white supremacy, to colonization of this country. You know, I'm calling in from Kalapuyan land in Oregon. I live outside of the state that I now work in. I work in California. I work on in an area that is a very diverse university system with 23 campuses with 29,000 faculty members. You know, we're all going through exactly what is being described in this conversation. So I'm making a lot of notes here, but I really believe that the sort of focus on how do we build power and how do we make it actionable has been certainly something that COVID has made very clear to folks in academia, that we have been on a cycle that has been destructive and has been completely reversing the goals of what we have believed academia to stand for in this country. And through the COVID struggle, folks are at a place where we're at a breaking point. You know, over 600,000 faculty members were laid off or lost work in higher education based off of figures from February. I'm sure it's higher now. You know, so we're really seeing a need, a desperate need to really re-envision what higher education looks like because of not just moral, but ethical reasons that people are being exploited, that they are experiencing fear and fatalism, stealing some words from Joe's book, Reclaiming the Ivory Tower, but certainly that we are really a working class faculty that has very real economic concerns. And the end result is that we can't show up for our students the way that we would want to, and we can't show up on issues that are critically important to the survival of our communities and our earth when we are unable to care for ourselves and take a moment to be physical and breathe and recognize the needs of us as physical people in these spaces. So I do have some things that I've been connected in through the post-capitalism conference that we had earlier this year as a way to bring faculty members together to talk about organizing higher education. And I won't go on further because I know I've been on a little soapbox for a moment, but I will just add that that's taking form now in a summit around higher education. I'm working with folks across the country from the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, the West, the Pacific Northwest, and we're really creating this group of exactly what Maggie is advocating for, folks that are postdoc, that are staff, that are students, that are, you know, faculty, that are lecturers, that are counselors, coaches, librarians, that encapsulates the whole gamut of what higher education looks like and says we need to take a stand in a way that unifies labor in higher education and puts energy towards supporting legislation that may do that as well.
Thank you, Nicola. That's very profound. I mean, and also, I mean, I think that organizing across the silos of different academic ranks, but also staff and faculty. I know at our campus, UMass Boston, we have the faculty staff union often is taking the lead from the professional staff union. And I mean, it reminds me again of Christine's book, that final moment between the librarian and Dorothy is also a moment of kind of mutual misrecognition, right? You kind of wonder, well, what if the staff folks knew more about the adjunctdom, right? And why is it that, you know, that Dorothy sees the librarian as equivalent to the university that's exploiting her rather than as a fellow worker, right? So, I mean, I think that alienation is crystallized so often throughout the text, but I think that's a particularly poignant and very relatable moment. And it's relatable also in the negative sense of like those kind of divisions among the the working class on the university and between students and faculty, divisions that don't have to be there, but are very deeply ingrained institutionally and ideologically, still, they wreck at attempts, they if unaddressed, right, without a broader framework for bringing people together, they continually will keep us fighting each other, right, in various ways, in petty, small ways as well as large ways, fighting for the scarce resources, right, and attention of an administration that really is what we should probably be focusing on, administration and the state. Joe Barry, what's your take? I mean, I know you've written a couple books on it, so you can't give us it all right now, but based on the conversation you've heard, I'd love to hear your take on what is to be done today, and what is being done.
Well, first, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And it is wonderful to me, as sort of the old guy who's now become sort of the uncle of the contingent faculty movement in some ways, now retired, but contingent from 90% of my career, to see all these younger people, doing this stuff, having this conversation, pushing the work forward. And thank you, Nicola, for your kind words about my previous book. I think that, I want to underline a couple of things that both Maggie and Nicola said. People need to, and I haven't read the novel, so I'm just going from the excerpts that have been read and Maggie's review, but there's a whole subgenre of adjunct literature that mostly is individualist in its focus. Does not include people getting together. It is about people being, as I believe Christine said, isolated and depressed. I believe I'm channeling you correctly or quoting you correctly. And, that's real, but that's not the whole story, and that's not the way things will change. And in fact, of all the contingent workers in the society, contingent faculty are the most unionized now and the most active collectively, and have pushed forward the most, with way more left to do. But 20% of us do have a union. Now sometimes they don't represent us very well, but that's huge compared to other contingent workers and the whole gig economy that's exploding all over the place. So I wanted to say that. Also, I want to reinforce what Nicola said about the situation changing her life, being a part of the CFA and the CSU system. I mean, our forthcoming book is basically, it's spun from a case study of the lecturers' struggle in the CSU system over the last 40 years and how they got what is basically the best, not far from perfect, but the best contract for contingent faculty in any four-year school in the United States. And that's a story we decided was worth telling, because I kept telling pieces of it on, interviews and phone calls and, that kind of stuff. And my wife finally got tired of being on the phone all the time and said, you really should write this book. And luckily, John Hess was still alive, who was the main leader of that struggle over that 40-year period. And we had a lot of conversations before he unfortunately died of Parkinson's prematurely. I want to say his name because he's one of the real leader heroes of this whole movement since the 70s, which is, where we need to start the story. I think we ended up devoting a whole chapter in our forthcoming book to the emotional aspect of this, to how it feels. But from the point of view of helping organizers get into that with their colleagues and take those feelings and channel them into collective action. That was our focus. And that's especially, of course, relationships between women, since the majority of contingent faculty are women, since a disproportionately large number of them are people of color. It has to deal with issues of the way sexism feels, the way racism feels for those who are the targets of it, and everything from microaggressions to to wholesale, measurable discrimination in huge ways. There is a thing out there right now that gets said a lot, that sort of and people referred to it obliquely, that what's happening in the economy as a whole, the rise of the gig economy, the impact of COVID, that sort of we're all contingent now, the whole economy. That's yes and no. Certainly, people are more insecure and are more aware of their insecurities economically and in terms of their jobs than before. But it's not true that everybody is equal. This hasn't come down equally. A rising tide doesn't lift all boats. Some of them get swamped, some of them sink, and people drown. I think, I don't remember who said that. Who said that first? Kennedy said it at one time. So it's a mixed story. Maggie's review is unusually cogent and complete. I'm somebody who, is an inveterate reader and reads hundreds of reviews, and had, read The Nation for, 50 years. And really a remarkable review. And it doesn't wimp out at the end like so many books and nonfiction books and reviews do, which is just wonderful. And I wanted to say that out loud. Also, I wanted to mention the mythology that academia is, that there was a golden age somehow, that academia met the image of our idealization of it. And I don't think that's true. I mean, I'm a historian, and I'm a historian of labor and of education. And I don't think that's true. It's always been a terrain of struggle, but that's more exposed now than it was before. And that's a good thing. It's never been, before, when the so-called golden age excluded the vast majority of women and people of color and people who were not born into the upper middle class with white male skins and male genitals. That was supposedly the golden age, the 25 years after the World War II. But that's, it's bullshit. People had to fight for entry. And the other thing is the focus on discussion, and I'm going to say something that I hope will generate some discussion here. The focus of this discussion and the use of the word university repeatedly drives me crazy. The majority of higher education is not universities, especially not R1 universities, especially not elite R1 universities like the Ivy League. The vast majority of the people we should be talking about teach in open entry community colleges. That's the plurality. And especially in California, where the community college system is the largest single system of higher education in the United States. But that's and a whole lot of our colleagues don't have PhDs. They especially don't have PhDs from elite schools that make them eligible for tenure track jobs in elite or semi-elite schools, because virtually all those jobs go to people from less than 20, with PhDs from less than 20 universities. And this is not meant to be a slam at Maggie or other people who come out of that context. My wife does as well. She went to Harvard at the time when Harvard women were not allowed into all the libraries. Actually, really. She was one of the first classes where they got Harvard degrees instead of Radcliffe degrees. So I think it's important to say that, and that, but also now to say the Harvard thing, your thing about the caps is just inhumane. And that is the single issue that was the key issue that organized the lecturers in the University of California system. That is the key issue around which they organized and around which they have continued to struggle, for now 40 years.
Joe, just to clarify, you said the caps, you by that you meant, can you just to make sure?
2 years and out, 3 years
Right.
and out.
Right. Okay, that's what I thought. Right.
The cap on time and there was an informal cap in most departments in the CSU system before people organized, and people had to fight against that too. And that history is different, but parallel.
Yeah, Joe, could I jump in for a moment, because we're going to lose. This is all great stuff, and please keep the list. We're still going for another at least half hour, perhaps even to 9 o'clock if the audience wants to sustain that. But we are going to lose Christine Smallwood
Yes.
to other duties in a moment, and I just wanted to not only give her a chance to say goodbye, but I did want to give her a chance to talk a little bit briefly. If she said she could, she private messaged me about one question I had for both Maggie and Christine is that because you're clearly both invested in different ways, research wise. I know for Maggie, Christine, in terms of your own practice with this with alternative or experimental extracurricular, if you will, educational projects. Maggie's focus on the Radcliffe study, the independent, I don't have the name right in front of me, but the independent study, I'll let you.
You just call it the Radcliffe Institute. It's fine.
There you go, the Radcliffe Institute. And Christine, currently with the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. And Christine, before losing you, I wondered if you could say a little bit about that work, how you understand that you were one of the co-founders of that project. That's an ongoing project. And I'm kind of curious what you see the relationship between the work of that institution and some of these other institutions we've been talking about so critically today. What do you see as that relationship, and what is the work? I mean, what kind of plug you could give us so we can find out more about the work y'all are doing?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to thank Maggie and Nicola and Joe. I think everything you guys said is so important and so true, and particularly the point about how most contingent faculty members are not in elite institutions. I mean, that really can't be said too often. So the Brooklyn Institute, I was one of 4 original founders of the Brooklyn Institute. We were 4 Columbia grad students, and we founded it in 2012. And the idea was that it would be an alternative teaching and research space. I mean, I think all 4 of us kind of saw the writing on the wall about like where the traditional university was headed. And so the idea was that at that time, we allowed anyone who was ABD was how we determined who could be hired or who could teach a class. And the idea was that you would keep 70% of the tuition that was charged. And so the idea, and we started out teaching 6-week classes, and I think now they're mostly 4-week classes, and all the classes would meet in public spaces. So like in bars or restaurants or like bookstores or like a million different public spaces, art galleries, whatever, community centers, like the, I don't know, there's different like cultural centers that the classes meet in, like the Goethe Institute and stuff. And that was 2012. And I've taught a handful of classes with the Brooklyn Institute. And then over time, I became less and less involved. And now I'm really not involved and can't take any credit for anything they do. The Institute is run by Ajay Chowdhury and Suzanne Schneider, and they actually employ like a few full-time people who are paid on W-2s. It's so successful. And there are Brooklyn Institute campuses or like centers in various cities, and they're just like thousands and thousands and thousands of people have taken Brooklyn Institute classes. And I mean, I think now the Institute is starting to conceive of itself, now that the sort of teaching model is really, really well established. I think they're starting to think about how they can start to do research and like, what does it mean to go to an academic conference and say, I'm from the Brooklyn Institute of Social Research? Because I think that, I guess there really are like 2 paths forward, right? One is to reform the traditional university through labor organizing, and one would be to abandon the traditional university and start, other kinds of centers of intellectual power. The idea that the university has a monopoly on intellectual culture, as I think, is a really bad idea.
Very interesting stuff. We'll check that out. We will share that link. I think we already did, maybe in our email that went out to all the folks that follow the show. but we'll definitely check out that work. And Christine, I'm speaking as if I'm assuming you do need to go. So I just want to thank you again for being here. I know you have other responsibilities.
I'm really sorry. I have some family obligations that were unexpected, but I just want to thank everyone so much. This was really, really interesting. And I really wish I could stay and hang out and learn more.
Well, we're recording. It will be on YouTube, and I hope that we can continue the conversation one way or another in writing and in speech, and maybe in Brooklyn or Boston.
And everybody check out the Brooklyn Institute. It's really, really amazing and inspiring. And I hope it spawns like 1,000 similar community groups.
Yeah, well, I think Linda and I are already thinking about a Dorchester Institute.
Cool.
I think as you
put you in touch with them if you want to talk to them.
Let's do it. Okay, thank you so much. And if folks have questions for Christine, you didn't get a chance to ask, relay them to us. We'll send them on to her. Thank you, Christine, so much for being here.
Sorry, I have to go.
All right, Linda.
All right, so I think it's time to take questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, you can either put them in the chat box or you can raise your hand. Just go to the reactions button and raise hand, and we will call on you in the order that we get your questions. So I think one of our co-producers, Rachel, has a question.
Sure. This can be for anyone feels like they need to answer it, but coming from a current undergrad student, how do you think that like your own experience of precarity and sort of understanding that these jobs, right, like that do not exist anymore, how does that influence your mentorship of students and your encouragement of them to pursue higher education, and like, does it pose a conflict? And like, how do you broach that?
Great question. Who wants to dare to take that one? And you are being recorded. Maggie, you want to take
sure,
that?
Yeah, I mean, I can start us off. I guess I'll just share maybe like an illustrative story about this. So in one of my jobs was teaching in a interdisciplinary program for students majoring in history and literature. Very, very cool program. It's also kind of where Harvard has not historically had ethnic studies, and so this program sort of did ethnic studies instead. So it was a really kind of important program for a lot of students for that reason. Really, really loved teaching in it. After 3 years, I had to go. And I had developed really close relationships with a bunch of students who I'd worked with very, very closely. And one of them wanted me to advise her thesis. And she didn't sort of make this clear. She was writing me emails, and then she found me at my next job and asked, can we have coffee? Can we sit and talk about my work? And we did. And then eventually she sort of said, I really want you to advise my thesis. Like, I don't know how to write this thesis without you. And I felt so conflicted because I wanted to help her, and I thought she was a great student. I thought she was going to write a great thesis, but I had been kicked out of the program, so I wasn't going to get paid to do it. And it just felt like this awful moment because I eventually said to her, I would love to work with you. Will you go back and ask the department if they'll pay me? Well, that's kind of the only way I can do it. And they wrote to me and said, we think you'd be a wonderful thesis advisor. We cannot pay you. And so eventually, I didn't take her on as a student. And it just seemed sort of too bad. I don't really have any better thing to say about that than just what a shame that I'd worked with the student and mentored the student. We wanted to keep working together, but because of the high turnover rate, because of my status in the university, which meant that I couldn't, in the way that a tenured track faculty member, a tenure stream faculty member wouldn't have needed to get paid for that because they're on a salary and it's kind of assumed that they do this kind of work. And I had a moment of feeling kind of selfish that I wanted to be paid to do this work, because I was thinking, well, shouldn't I just want to help this student? Isn't that why I'm a teacher? Isn't it? And it just brought up all those feelings of, is it bad for me to say, well, no, this is actually a lot of work and I can't do this work if I'm not going to be compensated for it. So yeah, I don't have a neat bow to put on the story, but that is one way that Rachel, that your question, that the question you asked, that's kind of one version of how it's happened for me.
Really interesting point, Maggie. And I mean, I was in a similar situation recently, and I actually, Rachel knows this because she was one of the students who I took on an independent study with, even though I do not get any compensation. I actually took on 9 students and created essentially another unpaid class, kind of using my paid work at the university to kind of subsidize the labor of love and radical education, right? That it ultimately should all be about. But there's really that's not a sustainable operation. And if I didn't have a strongly unionized NTT position that at least makes a contingent position one you can live on to some degree, I wouldn't have been able to make that choice. And not to say that's the right choice. It's just, it was a choice available to me. But it's not one I could make every semester, I'll tell you right now, because it's basically adding a 5th course, right, to a load that's already too much. Just my own little anecdote there. Joe, did you want to speak to Rachel's question as well about or to respond to Maggie? Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to say, this is why we say our working conditions are our students' learning conditions, very, very directly. And it can't be said often enough, and it can't be given enough examples such as Maggie just described.
Yeah, well said. Nicola, jump right in. I think you're muted.
There we go. I'm so excited. I just felt like, the mantra of our teaching conditions, our student learning conditions, is something that we just say time and time again in organizing faculty labor in the CFA. And I have this challenge a lot of the times with just being unwilling to shore up the inadequacies of the administration on my own back. And I know that translates to not being able to show up for my students the way that I would want to. But I also am unwilling to take on that burden when for us with the CSU, they sit on over 1.5 billion in reserves. And so for a lowly lecturer like myself, asking for a reasonable salary, for just compensation and for benefits, I think it is unacceptable that faculty continually are put in this position where they have to internalize their guilt over their commitment, and that the university actually weaponizes our commitment, to borrow some of the language from one of my colleagues, Sarah Ray, to get us to take on work, because a lot of times that's something that we can use to demonstrate our viability, our worthiness, our value within the system. And so, I really think that a lot of times, to circle back to some of the questions that we're asking, who's benefiting from this? I just think to that historical context that Joe was pointing us towards a moment ago, and thinking about how things from the 1970s have been transitioning, and the very realness of the neoliberal model in higher education, that these are profit-driven models that are treating faculty in the exact same way, even if you're at a public university, that you would in a corporate space. And so we do see increases of upper management positions during COVID. We do see more money going towards police and law enforcement during COVID. All of these things that ultimately take away from the experiences of our students, because they're really the relationships, the community, the things that are really the justifications for students being there, is not prioritized within the system. They're trying to get it for as cheap as they can to provide that product for our students.
Yeah. And even many of as you know, Nicola, and I was hoping you might speak about this a bit too, around the College for All proposal, right? Even many of those who are pushing for expanding college access, right, are not addressing the issue of faculty labor working conditions adequately enough, and also the focus on making community college free, but not as robustly focusing on sometimes some organizations, at least on public universities or other universities, right? I mean, it really, there's a danger that, okay, we create access, we improve access, okay, reduce student debt, great, but will higher education and higher learning be really made available? But will the student teacher ratios, right, that can enable actual relationship formation, right, and be available, right? It's great to reduce tuition, but if it's not paired with investment in the faculty and staff and campus resources that are necessary to make real quality education available to working class people, at least, right, then what are we really doing? And I think it's something that those of us who aspire for something more than just, free training to join the cog, to be a cog on the factory line or whatever, we aspire to actually making that best education that's available, the higher learning in a true sense, available to all. Like, we don't settle for that, right? That we don't settle for that. And I actually think, Maggie, I'm thinking of your review of Christine's book too, where you say, like, if there is utopia, or if there is hope or something kind of positive in the take on higher education and the humanities in the novel, it's the prose itself and Dorothy's consciousness, even if it's unspoken a lot, like, glistens with the penetrating insight that a higher education, in the best sense, humanities education doesn't always yield. Right?
But I think the novel's pretty ambiguous about the value of that.
That's right.
For Dorothy, because
That's
it hasn't galvanized her into, and this is of course not a kind of moral condemnation of a character, but just that she has the understanding of her conditions, she has the language to talk about them, and she has a certain kind of satisfaction in being able to look at what's going on and say, actually, the apocalypse that we're facing is more like this kind. Frank Kermode says this about apocalypse, and that's kind of right, but not quite right. And I think that is, there is utility in that, but it hasn't given her any way to change her circumstances or anything to do. And I think that the point that's been made earlier about how she's isolated, she's not collectively doing anything, she's by herself, is part of why this education of hers hasn't actually helped her change her circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Joe?
Yeah, lots to respond to. I think that in terms of the individual example that you gave, Maggie, which is great, it brings up the point that we really need to borrow from the gay movement the idea of coming out of the closet. We can hide from our students, and many people hide from their families, even from some of their more colleagues and other workers on the campus. We need to come out of the closet and say what our situation is, and appeal for solidarity, not charity. The victim metaphor is done, is over, and it should be over. And not to say that we don't need to speak bitterness among ourselves, and that's part of the organizing process, as you well know as an organizer. But we need to come out of the closet, and that's really important as a step toward collective action, and the ability then to appeal to people for solidarity as fellow workers, and to recognize. I'm so glad that Nicola spoke to this, and it really is an ideology that has become a part of the CFA, as well as the anti-racism has become a very basic part of the CFA going forward, which is one of the reasons why they're not a perfect union, but a model for the rest of the faculty union movement in the United States. We need to, moving people toward collective action. That's a part of this, and part of it is recognizing who we are. We're majority women. We're largely disproportionately people of color, and that means the relationships that people have and need, are those relationships based on those experiences. And the movement has been disproportionately led by white guys, and that needs to change and is changing somewhat. But the focus of that aspect, evidently in the novel, is a very good one and very important, and on parenthood and partnerhood and how that impacts everything that people experience. I think that the current debate over college for all and the Bernie Jaipal bill, which is much better than what Biden is putting forward, because at least it has some labor characteristics, some labor factors in it. Not enough, not good enough, but it does make a more than a titular bow in that direction. And the Scholars Coalition for a New Deal for Higher Education, or I'm getting the title slightly wrong, but that I think needs to be, contingent faculty need to be a part of that. And there's a debate in the contingent faculty movement over, how much we should endorse this and join that debate, and how much we should say that's not enough. It's happening on our backs, as you mentioned before. That the expansion of higher ed is happening on our backs, and how much do we say about that? Especially those of us in California who are a little older, who can remember free higher education, right? I was a teacher in the community colleges in California at the moment tuition came in. The last free higher education in the United States finally was lost. And the next year I had classes with no Black students for the first time in my whole career. I mean, it was tiny tuition. It was tiny, but it was enough to push people out. And, and yet at the other end of the spectrum, at places like Harvard, they actually have people, and not an insignificant number, who teach as adjuncts for free, just to be able to have that on their business cards for their various legal or psychological or something practice. My sister-in-law was one of those people, so I'm aware of this. And where they could actually get people to teach for fucking free. Excuse me, but
warranted.
It's an interesting organizing problem when you're like, oh gosh, Brett Kavanaugh's in our bargaining unit. Like, what are we going to do about that? Because he's like officially an adjunct professor at the law school. But yeah, it's wild.
There's all these ways of deferring payment and pain, right? Also, even student debt itself allows people to teach and feel like they're middle class or something for a while, and just defer the pain for 5 years until the loans come due. It's just all these ways of separating the moments in the worker's life. Yeah, Joe, let's hear a little more, and then I want to hear Nicola on this bill as well. Yeah.
Syndrome of the celebrity adjunct is the other thing that needs to be mentioned. But somebody raised the question earlier in the discussion, and I wanted to respond to this, is what is real? That whole notion. You look in the mirror one day and am I a professor, or am I just doing this until something that better comes along? Or, it's sort of like a perpetual imposter syndrome that people have when they get a new promotion or get a new job, but we live with it for our whole lives. And it's reflected back to us constantly, not just with this, the experience of that librarian that you read about was really good.
Yeah.
So the other thing I just wanted to mention was the fact that, and this is building on what Nicola said, it's key that we put forward and transmit to ourselves, to our colleagues, all the time that, we're now part of the working class. We need to say that out loud. We are we're educated, professional, highly specialized workers. That's not true of the traditional tenure track faculty, who were in a much more contradictory class location, right? They had property rights to their jobs. Many of them could make other money using those skills in other ways. But we are workers, and people are figuring that out. And therefore we can appeal to our mostly working class students, not the elite higher education, but the majority of higher education. We're talking about working class students. We can appeal to them and their parents and their families on a basis of solidarity, which is really new in the world, right? This is the first time, this is new in the world, and it's important. And I think that opens the door to strategies for the future, like we talk about in our book. That's what we're getting to, is that was really different. We need to present ourselves to the public and not be embarrassed to say, we have needs as workers. We also have needs for academic freedom and to perform the services that we need, that people need. But we're not, Lady Bountiful handing down from the high reaches of the ivory tower and professordom the wisdom to to a limited number of students who then go out and use that. That's not where it should be at. It's not where we're at, and it has some things to do with what the future of education, higher education, and research should look like in the future. And maybe it shouldn't look very much like the current university. I mean, that question has been raised, and it's worth pursuing. So
absolutely,
thank you for listening.
absolutely, yeah, Joe. And I mean, everything you're saying, I mean, I think we're getting probably some little snippets from the book and insight. I mean, we'd love to have you back to dive into the book as it comes out in August. Perhaps this fall we could do a follow-up show. We have a Saturday show. I can't speak for the producers of that show, but they focus on authors of new books, and we'll certainly propose this as an option for them as well, and we can get deeper into that. I mean, a couple of things I want to pick up from what you said before we go back to Nicola, and I think Linda has another question for Maggie, and then we'll do one more round. I guess this is my call for final questions or comments from our audience here, as we are at the 8:30 point, but we don't wrap up unless, for a few more minutes at least. But I mean, it seems to me that The Life of the Mind is a great book for crystallizing some of the things that hold people back from coming out in that way. I think and I think it's an example of a piece of literature that really, I think, crystallizes. I wouldn't want to universalize the experience for reasons that have been stated about different kinds of universities, different kinds of colleges, different kinds of higher ed that doesn't look like Columbia or whatever. But I do think that the novel does a terrific job, not to say that there aren't other texts that get at this as well, nonfiction as well as fiction, at really trying to crystallize some of those psychological and social kind of notions and affects and ideologies that hold people back, right, from embracing a kind of proletarianization or making public what they feel so intensely in private. And I think, these problems that Joe is flagging, I think, perhaps literature does have something to contribute to that, at least in terms of helping us to map the problem. And I think if we could have NTT's, faculty discussing this book, more, and or passages from it or reviews of it, even if people don't have time to read the whole novel, that would be, I think, potentially useful. One place to start, because some of those barriers are, I know people who are very committed to the union struggle, but still don't tell their students, right? That they're contingent because they feel it makes them vulnerable in a way that they're not comfortable with in the classroom. And I think that's material as well. It's not just ideological, right? And again, it's gendered and raced and classed and stuff, and I mean, I tend to be out there very robust with my students, and I think I get make a lot of hay of that, structure, kind of pulling the curtain away, right, as much as I can, right, in terms of how the university works. But that's not, if every faculty member did that, we'd be in a very different discussion, in a very different place. And so how do we get there? That's not morally judging, oh, you didn't do this, you need to be more militant, right? How do we create context and culture that enables that kind of courage, solidarity, trust, sympathy? These are the kind of challenges I think that we need to take seriously. Nicola, you've been waiting way too patiently. You should have jumped in and shouted over me hours ago. A lot of things that have been brought up, including but not limited to the College for All Act, that I know that you've been active and very informed about, but I don't want to limit you to that. I want to give you a chance to respond to things that have been said of your choice, and then we'll go back to Linda for maybe one more question for Maggie.
Well, thank you, Joe. And it's no worries. I really just am enjoying the conversation. And this to me is really the work in my mind, because I see education as a cornerstone of the way that we build and imagine and dream about our society. So when we're thinking about why we're in the classroom, of course, I can minimize my American Government 100 class to a performance for money. But then I also, when I think about how that fits into what I'm trying to achieve and the way that I am afforded a position of privilege in that space, there's so much that I'm just real with my students about, to justify why they are there, why it matters, why, when they are struggling to balance their full-time job with their full-time student requirements and their family obligations, why should they show up to environmental politics with Nicola Walters? What do they get out of that? And I firmly and hopefully believe that this is providing people with tools to think think about how they're going to engage with the world, and also to shape how, when they choose to engage, they know how to get involved. Because what we're talking about with people in the classroom, sometimes wanting to explore vulnerability of who they are, there are many people in our academic spaces that straight up just don't have the privilege to be vulnerable in the same way that other people get to be vulnerable in classrooms. My level of professionalism and the way that I present myself in the classroom has to be curtailed based off of my position in that university, or the way that I perceive myself within that space, the way my students perceive me, and then choose to use their student evaluations to critique and interpret their interaction with me, that then goes into my personnel files, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We are all linked in this system. And to me, I really think that that's why getting involved with particular pieces of legislation like the College for All Act, because the way that it has been presented by Senator Sanders and Representative Jayapal is a launching pad for us to think about the role of higher education and the role of policymakers in making visible our experiences, or at least taking a moment to think about what we are going through. So, there are a lot of things that are circulating around this particular piece of legislation, but the goal of bringing together unions and organizers and folks across the country to be a part of the summit conversation that we're hoping to have July 7th and 9th from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Our working title at the moment is Higher Education Summit, Building a Labor Movement to Transform Higher Education, for me, is really the building block. It's a way for us to make, we can talk about the successes of CFA historically, but CFA is getting we're in contract negotiations that will intensify this fall. That's the reality of what's going on. Every time we go to the bargaining table, we have an opportunity to build on our contract or to regress. We have struggles. Our front lines are in all of our academic spaces, but they are totally connected as well. And so it's my hope that we can continue these conversations in the summit to really have a solidarity vision statement that comes out of that. So I will be sharing this information with Shelter in Solidarity. They've been so kind to have me here on the show. Thank you all for this. And also this will be made more visible when we have it together. But it's all faculty, organizers across education in a variety of different situations that are recognizing that we have to put into action what we're talking about. We must stand together. And there is an opportunity right now politically for change and transformation that we haven't seen before. It's a real moment of thinking about what is working and how business as usual isn't working. So I'm really excited to be a part of that group and to be able to talk about the beginning phases of the summit planning.
Terrific, Nicola. And Rachel Patton just put in the chat box the information for those who are live. For those who are listening to this, watching this on YouTube afterwards or on Facebook, that's July 7th and 9th from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard. And you can contact Nicola at nwalters at calfac.org. That's the Higher Education Summit, Building a Labor Movement to Transform Higher Education. And we will put it in the description on YouTube. Great point, Rachel. And I'm going to try to attend. So thank you, Nicola, for being here and for your work out there on the West Coast. We'll hopefully have a national movement at some point. We can speak of a we that's really united through that summit. Great. Linda, I think you had a question for Maggie, and then we might move towards wrapping up, or maybe final words from our guests and respondents.
Well, it is definitely a question for Maggie, but I do also wish that Dorothy were here to answer it as well. So Maggie, at one point in your review of The Life of the Mind, you talk about what you call the wonderful excess to the writing, and you say, quote, excessive education might not earn you a job or help you achieve financial stability, but it can help you narrate desperate circumstances with a kind of indulgent accuracy. And so this novel's indulgent accuracy actually really inspired me. And so I'm wondering what kind of work you think this book might be able to do for other contingent faculty and their struggles. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've all kind of been talking about it, which is just this idea of making this light visible, just putting it out there in all of its, shittiness, kind of, just all of the sort of bad feelings, all of the material challenges. I mean, I think when I read the book a few times to write about it, but when I first read it, I just felt so seen. I know that's kind of a little like a kind of, especially for a book reviewer, you don't want usually you don't want to say, well, what I like about this book is it reminds me of me, but it was just so gratifying. I just, I'd read at campus novels, I'd read Mary McCarthy's books, and I'd read Richard Russo, and I read Philip Roth, and they just have this, I mean, a lot of them are from different historical moments, but they have this idea of higher education that, as we've been talking about, A, is very limited to a certain kind of institution, and B, just really doesn't happen anymore. It doesn't happen the same way. And so it was just such, again, to use a cliche, but like a breath of fresh air just to read a novel that says, oh, actually, like even at a fancy school, like this university that's probably Columbia, most of the teaching and learning looks like this. It doesn't look like, endowed chairs sitting at the head of seminar tables talking about poetry. It looks like this really kind of incomplete, conflicted, inattentive, ambivalent form of engagement. And that, that's not the sort of rosy idea of higher education a lot of people, I think, outside of the field have, and think, I'm sure that even, some of you have experienced the difficulty talking about your work or what you do and what your lives are like with people who don't know very much about colleges and universities and community colleges. I'm lucky enough to be partnered with an education reporter, so we don't have that problem. But it's hard to make yourself understood. And so, yeah, to see Christine represent this life in this way, in this really powerful way, was so exciting for me. I just hope it gets more people talking and coming together. And as Joe was saying, having reading groups and having discussion groups and then having action groups and talking things over. So yeah, I think that's, if the book itself is not kind of a call to action, I think maybe the book in the world can be sort of a call to action.
Yeah, that's interesting. You had that response that that you felt seen. Because I kind of had a similar feeling. I had this uncanny feeling that I was actually able to see the thoughts in my own head written on, in somebody else's book. So that was really, really inspiring.
Like Frederick Douglass says, upon reading works of anti-slavery philosophy in his teenage years, when he's illegally reading texts behind his master's back, right? It was nothing new, but it was to him, but it was right. He says, they gave expression to, words of, thoughts of my own soul that had crossed my brain, but passed away for want of utterance, right? Basically this, so I mean, it's not necessarily that the great artists tell us something new, but they help us they put something before us that we're already thinking in a way we can recognize, identify with or against, and perhaps share. Right. And that's kind of what we're doing here. And I've really enjoyed this conversation tonight on that basis. Joe Barry has put in the chat box, I want to say it aloud, another project beyond books. He is very involved in a news aggregator, a news source called Cocal. Joe, if you want to say a few words about that, but Cocal updates, it's like a weekly email, and you can get on that list if you're not on it already. Joe Barry, that JoeBerry at igc.org. That's the Cocal update. It's a very concise but comprehensive weekly update. If you're not on that list, please do get on it and tell your friends. Thanks for that resource, Joe. Any brief closing comments from Joe, Nicola, Maggie, Linda, or anyone else in our increasingly intimate gathering here?
Just thank you so much for putting this together. This has been really wonderful, and just really, encouraging as always to get in a room, not in a room, but in a Zoom room with other people thinking and talking about this stuff, and to feel, not alone with all of it.
Terrific. Yeah, I'm so glad to. Yeah, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say thank you for putting this together and for continuing not to have this be not a one-shot deal. One last thing I wanted to throw into the pot that hasn't been mentioned, but since this is the United States and the heritage of the Cold War and anti-communism and stuff, I think it's important to say that all of the significant struggles among adjuncts that I know of, having studied this for the last 30, 40 years, there's always a leftist in the woodpile. It's very important, and we need to say that out loud. Of various sorts, people coming out of the Panther Party, people coming out of the various left groups, people, but people with some kind of experience and a radical perspective and a vision for more than just pay equality for adjuncts, but
Right.
a vision to change the labor movement, to change the world. And John Hess, my late co-author, exemplified that. But that also means getting people to focus on organizing and doing work where they are. A lot of radicals do stuff for other people, but the idea of organizing and doing stuff where you are is very much more important and scary.
Yeah, well said, Joe. Yeah.
And that's that's something we can grab a hold of. But I think it was important. It's important to recognize the role of the political left in this whole movement and in this situation. And maybe one of our creative novelist friends will eventually write the novel that isn't just isolation and depression, but is collective struggle with a character who has a broader perspective as well. One can hope.
Thank you, Joe. In the meantime, we have collective spaces like this where we can take the forms like the novels that we have and make them, like Maggie was saying, make them a force in the world that builds on what the novelist has given us and makes it more, or makes it more than it was, or maybe makes it become itself what it already was when it's read by enough people or engaged by enough people. I want to thank Linda. It's been a pleasure hosting with you once again. I'm sure we'll be continuing the conversation in our own little private space on the other side of this door. I'm losing my light here because I'm working off of natural light out of my office. Any final words, Linda, before we wrap?
No, that's it. Just thank you everybody for this wonderful conversation.
All right. Thanks everybody. And thanks to Christine Smallwood, if you're watching. And we'd love to have you all back in some context. I know you're all working on great work, and we want to try to, not only give expand your audience, but expand the engagement and help nurture that creative process. I'm going to wrap us up here with the Shelter in Solidarity kind of boilerplate closing here. The show wouldn't be possible without our SNS production team: Linda Liu, Kira Mudliar, Seren Mudliar, Rachel Yaroshes-Patton, Tim Sheard, and Mark Soderstrom. Thank you all. We hold a once a month show during the summer. We'll be back probably doing 2 shows again in the fall, but we have a Saturday show we've added, which will be coming up June 26th with Eleni Makrakis, co-author of A People's Guide to Greater Boston. Speaking of doing engagement where you are here in the city of Boston, that'll be hosted by our Saturday team. So come back on June 26th and we'll continue that conversation. We also, I need to thank our co-sponsors: Community Church of Boston, a free community for the study and practice of universal religion; Encuentro Cinco, affectionately known as E5, a movement building project in downtown Boston, getting ready to reopen again in person, finally. Hardball Press, a leading publisher of labor and social justice stories for adults and children. You can find them at hardballpress.com. That's our co-producer, Tim Sheard's project. The Liberty Tree Foundation for the Democratic Revolution, an organization for serving and building the democracy movement. And last but not least, Socialism and Democracy, a scholarly journal that brings together the worlds of scholarship and activism, theory and practice to examine in depth the core issues and popular movements of our time. You can get a sense of our work there at sdonline.org, and we welcome your contributions in that format as well. Thank you, everyone, and good night.